The wind pushed a thin veil of dust across the parking lot as I eased my truck into a space near the crooked flagpole, the one that never quite settles no matter how steady the air is. A storm was building somewhere beyond the horizon, pressing a dull, heavy bruise across the late afternoon sky. When I cut the engine, the radio died mid-sentence, and the sudden quiet felt thicker than it should have been. The grocery store's neon sign flickered lazily, casting a tired glow over a couple wrestling with a stubborn trunk and a kid in a red hoodie fighting a runaway shopping cart. Ordinary scenes, but they felt slightly out of rhythm, like a song played half a beat too slow. I stayed there a moment, hands resting on the wheel, letting the quiet stretch. At my age, you learn to pay attention when the world goes still in a way that doesn't match the hour. The cooling engine ticked, counting off seconds I wasn't quite ready to step into. Then my phone lit up on the console, just one pulse of pale light cutting through the dim cab. The name of my investment firm glowed across the screen, clean and clinical, completely at odds with the small-town calm outside my window. I didn't reach for it. Something instinct-age, the leftover wisdom of too many hard years, held me in place. It wasn't fear, not yet, just the sense that whatever waited on that screen might change the shape of the evening, maybe even more than that. So I sat there, listening to the wind push at the mirrors, feeling the first hint of rain in the air while the truck settled into silence around me. Unaware that in the next breath, everything I thought I could count on was about to shift. The email came in just after I turned off the engine of my truck. I had parked in front of the grocery store on the south end of town. The one with the faded flag out front that never seems to hang straight no matter the wind. I remember the weight of a gallon of milk still on my arm and the sound of a shopping cart rattling somewhere behind me when my phone buzzed against the console. I glanced down, expecting a reminder or a note from Claire. Instead, I saw the name of my investment firm and a line of text that felt strangely out of place for a quiet afternoon. Extreme loss event. I opened the email and the number looked unreal at first, as if my eyes refused to bring it into focus. $3.2 million gone. For a long moment I didn't move. My hand rested on the steering wheel, the leather warm from the sun, and I felt my breath tighten the way it used to when the doctor first mentioned the word arrhythmia years ago. Shock at my age doesn't come with loud reactions. It settles deeper like a slow exhale you cannot quite finish. This was the money Laura and I saved through every lean year and every small victory, the money that came from selling the hardware store, from years of skipping vacations. So the mortgage would be lighter. It was our life's caution made visible. Now it was gone. My phone rang again. Grant Hollister spoke in a voice that tried to sound steady, but carried something held too tightly beneath it. He talked about market turbulence, unexpected conditions, a rare chain of events. He used phrases he knew I recognized, the comfortable language of long-term planning, risk adjustment, and strategic timing. As I listened, I felt an unease that had nothing to do with money. For 12 years I had trusted Grant. I had believed in his calm, but now that calm felt staged, as if a man were reading lines he had practiced the night before. I drove home slower than usual, taking the rural back roads, where the trees lean over the pavement like old neighbors trying to hear your thoughts. The sky had the color of worn denim, and the wind carried a hint of winter in it. Somewhere between the grain silos and the long stretch of empty farmland, Laura came to mind. Not her voice, not her smile, but the small habits that used to fill our days. The way she folded dish towels exactly 3 times, the notes she left in the kitchen drawer written in her looping handwriting. That money was supposed to keep me steady for years after she was gone. It was supposed to help Claire when she needed it and make sure Henry had a chance at a future bigger than this little town. When I got home, the porch light flicked on, a motion sensor reacting to my steps with a kind of gentle loyalty. Inside the house felt too still. There are evenings when an empty home is peaceful and evenings when it presses against you. I set the grocery bag down and walked into the small room Laura once used for her schoolwork. Her books were still arranged the way she liked them, tallest to shortest, and her scarf hung neatly over the back of the chair because I could never bring myself to move it. I sat where she used to sit, the fabric still faintly holding her scent even after all these years. On my laptop there is a folder I never talked about. I created it long before any of this happened. 147 recordings of calls with Grant, saved not out of suspicion, but out of habit. A habit born from running a shop for decades where forgetting even one detail could cost you money or trust. I opened the folder and saw the long list of files, each with a date I remembered or a subject I barely recalled. I clicked on one at random. Grant's voice filled the room, younger, lighter, promising safe yields and conservative moves. His tone once gave me comfort. Now it made me feel something else entirely. Later that night, the bank called. The representative spoke carefully, the way people do when they know the news is unwelcome. He explained that the transfer clearing out my account had been authorized with voice verification. He asked if I wanted to hear it. I agreed, though something deep inside warned me not to. The recording played through the line. It was my voice. The rhythm, the breath, the way I paused between numbers. But the words were wrong. Too formal, too perfect, as if shaped by someone who studied me from the outside and tried to build a version of me that never existed. When the call ended, I sat still for a long while. The image of Laura's scarf on the chair settled into the corner of my eye and would not move. I picked it up and placed it back down, careful not to disturb its folds. Her handwriting stared up at me from a small note still taped inside the drawer, a reminder she wrote the year Henry was born. Pick up more coffee. That was the whole note. Ordinary, harmless, but now it felt like a quiet reminder of everything steady that had once held my life together. The house hummed softly with the sound of the heater kicking on. I opened another recording. Grant talked about protection of principle, the need to avoid unnecessary risks, the importance of transparency. Each word chipped away at the trust I had built around him like a wall. I could hear sincerity in his voice, and I could hear something else, too. Something I had missed before, a tightness around the edges, a pause too long between sentences. Night settled deep into the windows and the world outside turned black. I leaned back in Laura's chair, the cushion thinning from time, and stared at the screen. I did not yet know what I was searching for, only that the truth was somewhere in those recordings, that losing $3.2 million was not an accident. Someone counted on my trust, someone counted on my grief, someone counted on the fact that a man my age would not question the voice that sounded like his own. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock. I sat there a long time, feeling the weight of the house, the weight of the years, the weight of a future suddenly pulled from under me. The light from the laptop dimmed, and I let the quiet settle around me like a reminder that the night had only just begun. The silence held on a little longer than I expected. I sat there in Laura's old chair, my hand resting on the desk, the blue glow from the laptop slowly fading across the floorboards. A faint chill moved through the room, the kind that settles in old houses after midnight. My fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something heavier. A weight I had not felt in years. I placed my hand over the scarf draped across the back of the chair, letting the familiar texture pull me back into the moment. A recording started again before I could stop it. Grant's voice filled the room, warm and steady the way it always did when he wanted me to feel safe. He explained something about yield curves and long-term positioning, speaking with the ease of a man who had rehearsed these lines so often. They had become second nature. Listening now, every inflection felt slightly too deliberate, like an actor repeating a script he no longer believed in. I reached toward the laptop, then paused, letting the sound wash over me. My hand trembled again. That tremor told me more about my state of mind than any thought could. His voice pulled me back to a different day. Laura's funeral. The church was cold that morning, the kind of cold that seeps through wool coats and polite conversations. I remember the smell of old hymnals and the sound of footsteps echoing over the tile floor. People moved in and out of view, offering soft condolences that blurred into each other. Then a man stepped forward holding a small bouquet of lilies. He had a quiet, respectful way of standing, hands folded in front of him, waiting until the moment felt right to speak. He told me his name was Grant Hollister. He said he worked with Laura years ago on a charity project, something involving supplies for underfunded schools. I had no reason to doubt him. Laura always left good impressions on people. When he spoke about her, his voice dipped a little as if he felt the loss too. I do not remember his exact words, only the warmth in them. That alone made him stand out in a room full of formal condolences. Later that night, Claire mentioned that Laura always said Grant had gone through hard times in his early career and come out wiser. A man who learned the hard way, she said. I accepted that without question. Laura rarely misread people. Her trust in him became my trust in him quietly, naturally, like something handed down. Over the years, Grant eased his way into our lives without ever pushing. He visited during Labor Day weekends, rolling up his sleeves and flipping burgers beside me, as if he had been doing it for decades. He talked about baseball, the long winters, the best place to buy firewood. Nothing about him felt like business during those days. He sat on the porch with me in July, lemonade in hand, while we watched cars hum down the road. He gave Henry a small model train set for Christmas one year. He sat on the carpet and helped the boy set the track, humming along with the engine as if he had all the time in the world. It was easy to forget he was my advisor. Easy to forget he held the reins to everything I had worked for. I paused the recording. The heater in the hallway clicked on, sending a soft hum into the room. I leaned back and felt the old chair give under my weight. In the corner, the lamp Laura used for grading student essays leaned slightly to one side, its shade crooked as always. I reached out and straightened it without thinking. When my hand pulled away, I noticed a small card tucked near its base, one Laura had written long ago for a charity auction. Her handwriting was neat, looping steady. Seeing it made my chest tighten in a familiar way, the kind that comes from remembering someone too well. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the window, rattling it lightly. I let the sound settle before opening another recording. My voice filled the room first, then his. I asked about risk, and he answered with that slow, soothing confidence. He spoke about low-risk instruments, capital preservation, the importance of not exposing myself to unnecessary volatility. His tone dripped with reassurance. It used to make me feel safe. Tonight it made me feel like I had been lulled to sleep. A memory surfaced with surprising clarity. A few months back I had visited the local bank. The clerk, a young man with neat hair and a shy smile, had paused when he looked at his screen. He had asked if I knew someone named Ethan Marston. I frowned and told him no. He laughed lightly, said it must be a software error, and moved on. At the time it felt like nothing. Now the name echoed in my mind like a misplaced key. Someone had used my surname. Someone had created a ghost out of thin air. The puzzle piece hovered just out of reach, but I could feel its shape now, sharp and deliberate. I turned back to the lamp and traced my fingers along its shade. Laura always believed the best in people, sometimes more than they deserved. She had a way of seeing potential where others saw flaws. That kindness was one of the reasons I fell in love with her and one of the reasons I sometimes worried for her. Looking around the room surrounded by the things she left behind, I wondered if her trust had extended too far. Maybe she saw something in Grant that I could not. Maybe she trusted him in ways she never told me about. Not secrets, not betrayal, just quiet acts of hope. A belief that a man who stumbled could learn to walk straighter. But trust can be a doorway as much as a shield, and I began to wonder whether someone had stepped through that doorway long before I realized it was open. The recording played on. Grant's voice softened when he mentioned my retirement, softened again when he spoke about keeping my future secure. There was a moment barely noticeable when he said Laura's name. He said it softly, almost reverently. Back then I took comfort in that. Hearing it now, the softness carried a different weight. It hinted at familiarity, a closeness I had not questioned. A tremor moved through my hand again. I pressed it against the armrest until it steadied. The scarf brushed my elbow, a reminder of everything I had already lost and everything I stood to lose if I did not look closer. The wind tapped at the window once more. A loose branch shifted outside. The house breathed in its slow, familiar rhythm. I sat there in the dim light, letting all the threads settle where they wanted. Grant at the funeral. The bank clerk asking about Ethan, the way his voice curled around Laura's name, the warmth he carried into our home, the ease with which he had become part of our lives. None of it felt accidental anymore. I did not start another recording. I let the room go quiet and listened to the soft hum of the heater, the way the night folded itself around the house. Something told me I was standing at the edge of a truth I was not ready to face. I rested my hand gently on the scarf one more time, then let it pull to my side. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself had paused, waiting for whatever came next. The darkness settled around the house in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the walls themselves understood something had shifted. I sat for a while longer in Laura's chair, letting the quiet fold over me. My fingers brushed the scarf once more, then dropped away when I stood. The air in the hallway felt cooler, as if the house exhaled while I walked through it. I set the mug from the night before in the sink without turning on the light, then pulled on my coat and stepped outside. Morning arrived, pale and thin frost clung to the edges of the windshield. I scraped it with the back of an old loyalty card, watching the white crystals fall in small curls. My breath left brief ghosts on the air. I started the engine and sat for a moment, palms resting on my knees, gathering the steadiness I needed. The truck rumbled beneath me, and for a second I felt grounded. Then the memory of the signature in Grant's file rose again, and the steadiness slipped a little. Traffic moved slowly on the freeway toward Columbus. I watched the lines of cars drift in and out of view, each driver living out their own quiet routines. It made my situation feel almost unreal, as if what waited for me in that downtown office belonged to a different story, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. Grant's building rose against the muted sky, all glass and steel and polished ambition. I parked a block away and walked toward it, hands deep in my coat pockets. The revolving door pushed a gust of warm air at me as I entered the lobby. The receptionist greeted me with a soft smile, her voice polite and trained smooth by repetition. "He is expecting you," she said, nodding toward the inner office. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of cedar and cologne met me. It used to feel comforting. Today it felt staged. Grant stood behind his desk, aligning a pen with the edge of a notepad. When he looked up, he smiled, but something in his eyes flickered. He motioned for me to sit. "Good to see you," he said, clearing his throat in a way that sounded planned rather than spontaneous. His hand drifted toward the folder on the corner of his desk. He rested his fingertips on it for a second too long, tapping lightly as if buying time. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but I caught it. When he finally pushed the folder toward me, he exhaled with a tightness that did not match his calm expression. I opened it. The first document showed a large transfer into something labeled Dynamic Market Responsive Vehicles. The paper felt thick under my fingertips, high quality, the sort used for documents meant to look official. My gaze dropped to the bottom of the page and everything inside me paused. The signature was mine. Clean, steady, confident. The date below it struck deeper than the ink itself. The morning Henry was born. The morning I sat beside Claire in a hospital room far from here. I looked up. My voice came out quiet, nearly flat. I wasn't here that day. Grant's jaw shifted, a small movement quickly masked by a practiced smile. He reached for a pen and twirled it slowly between his fingers. Another tiny gesture he seemed unaware of. His voice softened. "We have camera logs," he said gently. "Timestamps. Everything lines up. There is no discrepancy on our end." His eyes slid past me toward the window for a brief moment, not long enough to be obvious, but just long enough that I noticed. He brought his gaze back quickly, but the moment had already registered. He pushed another sheet forward. Grainy images of a man entering the office, my height, my shape, nothing clear enough to confirm anything. He said in a low voice that we can sort through any confusion. But my hands had already tightened on the edge of the folder. I closed it slowly, placed it back on his desk, and rose. He stood too quickly, almost bumping into the desk. A faint tremor moved through the hand. Still holding the pen. I watched him place it down carefully, aligning it with the notepad again. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, but no words came. I walked out before he found them. The door clicked softly behind me. In the hallway, 2 employees spoke near the water cooler. I heard one of them mention something about restricted accounts and a name that sounded too close to Ethan for coincidence. Their voices lowered when they noticed me. I kept walking. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Back home, the sun had already started to sink. The house absorbed the dimness like a familiar habit. I sat again in Laura's room, turning on the lamp with its crooked shade. The light fell in a quiet halo over the desk. I pulled up the folder of recordings and scrolled until I found the file from the week Henry was born. The audio clicked on. My voice asked about risk. His answered with steady reassurance. "Nothing moves without your say." He repeated the word nothing the way a man repeats a promise he needs you to believe. I stopped the recording and leaned back. My hands came together on my lap. The tremor returned. I steadied them with a slow breath. The bank's verification clip replayed in memory. My voice without warmth, without breath, without the small imperfections that make a voice human. A voice constructed, lifted, assembled. My words present, but not mine. There had been news stories about scams like that. Voices cloned from voicemails and customer service calls. It seemed impossible until the moment it was done to you. The room felt colder. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the scarf, letting the fabric anchor me to something real. The ticking in the wall returned steady but faint. It sounded like time marking itself off in measured pieces, each one inching me closer to a truth I had not yet fully seen. Someone had taken my signature, my voice, the shape of my presence in this world, and turned it into a tool, not just stolen but transformed. Directed to an end designed to strip away everything Laura and I spent a lifetime building. I let out a slow breath. The lamp flickered once and steadied itself. The shadows on the wall stretched softly as the house settled into another quiet evening. I did not turn on another recording. I sat there listening to the heater hum to life again, the faint movement of air brushing the back of my neck. The weight of the room shifted as if waiting for the next thought to land. The truth was taking shape slow and unmistakable, and the shape it formed was darker than I wanted to admit. The lamp flickered once more before settling into a steady glow. I sat there a moment longer, letting the last threads of thought drift through the room. Then I reached for my coat, the fabric cold from the night air that lingered in the hallway, and made my way toward the front door. The house watched me leave with the same quiet it had kept since Laura passed, a quiet that followed me down the steps and into the morning. Frost still clung to the yard untouched by sunlight. I brushed a thin layer from the truck handle and pulled myself in. The engine turned over slowly, like it needed convincing. As I drove toward town, the roads widened into stretches of bare trees and gray sky. I tried to focus on the shapes outside the window, anything that could keep my mind steady. But every thought led back to the files on my desk and the voice that was not mine. Howard lived 2 towns over in a small brick house at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with old maples. I pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment, letting the engine quiet. The house looked the same as always. Curtains slightly parted a wreath on the door, even though the holidays had passed. I remembered Laura standing on this porch once, carrying a pie she made for Howard's wife. That memory rose with such clarity it made the cold feel sharper. I walked up the steps and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Howard stood there in a sweater and pressed slacks, his hair neatly combed back. Age had softened his face, but not his eyes. Those still held the sharpness of the attorney. He had been the one who built a reputation for seeing through lies with little more than a glance. He stepped aside without a word. I entered. The house smelled of coffee and cedar, familiar and steady. We moved to his study, a room lined with books that had clearly been read more than once. I set my laptop in the folder on his desk and watched him adjust his glasses before sitting. He asked me to begin. I opened the recordings. The first one played softly through the speakers, my voice rising, then Grant's smooth and warm. Howard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening as if the file were a medical chart, and he was searching for the first sign of disease. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. When the recording ended, he nodded once, then asked for the next. We went through several like that. At one point, he lifted a hand, signaling me to pause. He rewound a few seconds and listened again. His expression tightened. "This promise," he said, pointing lightly at the desk. "It contradicts the product he recommended." He leaned back, fingers tapping on the armrest with quiet precision. I watched him run the facts through whatever internal system had served him well for decades. Another recording played. He stopped it halfway. "Latency is too clean," he said, speaking slowly, almost to himself. "A natural call has small delays." His gaze sharpened as he looked at me. There was no question in his expression, only confirmation. I told him about the forged signature, the timestamp, the camera images that did not show a face. I told him about the voice verification clip that still echoed in the back of my mind. The room held the weight of each detail like stones piling onto a scale. Howard folded his hands. "You said Laura had a backup system," he said. "Something she set up for your files." I nodded. Laura always insisted on copies of everything. Tax records, school documents, scanned photos, even drafts of emails she worried she might lose. I had not touched the backup since she passed. It felt like a cabinet of memories best left cleaned. "Retrieve it," he said gently. "There may be old audio files in there, something that did not make it into your main folder." The drive was still in my truck. I had brought it without thinking why. I retrieved it and handed it to him. He plugged it into his computer and waited as the screen lit with rows of folders. He clicked through quietly, pausing now and then, reading names Laura once wrote in her careful handwriting. Near the bottom, beneath layers of older files, sat a folder labeled Calls Alt. I did not remember creating anything with that name. Howard opened it. Inside were dozens of recordings, most duplicates, some corrupted, some unfamiliar. He clicked one at random. Static filled the speakers for a moment, then a voice emerged. Grant. He spoke differently in this recording. Slower, carefully. The warmth was thinner, as if he assumed someone else might be listening. Then another voice entered, calm and steady. I felt something tighten in my chest. Howard paused the file. "That is Samuel Drake," he said quietly. I had heard the name before. CEO of the firm, a man who rarely appeared except in newsletters and framed photographs in Grant's office. Hearing his voice now felt like stepping into a room I was never meant to enter. Howard restarted the file. Samuel spoke in phrases that sounded harmless at first. Reclassify tolerance, optimize risk buckets, move high net worth clients through the new channel. His tone never sharpened, never hesitated. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed. Howard leaned in, listening more intently than before. He paused again and looked at me. "These are not instructions for legitimate adjustments," he said. "These are coded directives. They are managing losses by redistributing client risk without disclosure." His voice dropped a little, carrying the weight of someone who had seen the inside of too many legal battles. "This is deliberate." The room felt smaller as I absorbed the words. I looked at the recording timestamp. It was from years ago when Laura was still alive. A thought crossed my mind, faint but sharp. Had she ever come across this without realizing what it was? Had she brushed against something that was never meant for her? I closed the laptop softly. The motion felt like sealing a door that should have been closed years ago. Howard walked me to the door. The afternoon light had shifted, turning the street a muted gold. He rested a hand on the frame, a gesture of quiet understanding. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring everything." I nodded. Outside, the air felt colder than when I arrived. I walked to my truck slowly, the driveway stretching longer than usual. The keys felt heavy in my hand. When I sat inside, I did not start the engine right away. I looked at the road ahead, blurred slightly by the low sun. This was no longer about a mistake or a bad investment or a man who failed at his job. Something deeper ran through the foundation of it. Something that had been in motion long before I ever pressed record on the first call. As I finally turned the engine over, the faint vibration traveled through the steering wheel to my palms, grounding me. The street lay quiet, lined with bare trees and evening shadows. I sat there in the fading light, feeling the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood. The truth was widening, and somewhere inside that widening space I sensed the first shape of what waited on the other side. The drive back from Howard's house felt longer than it should have. The sky had slipped into that late afternoon color, not quite evening, not quite day. The kind of light that makes everything look honest in a way you wish it would not. I followed the familiar roads home, past the feed store, past the little diner where Laura used to order pie, past the school where Henry spent his mornings. Each landmark reminded me I could not hold this alone much longer. Sooner or later I would have to bring it to Claire. When I pulled into my driveway, her car was already there. The small silver sedan sat to one side, a thin trail of warmth still rising from the hood. For a brief second, something like relief touched me. She had come on her own. I did not have to ask. I stepped into the house. The smell of coffee and laundry detergent met me. Claire stood by the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing in particular. She looked up when she heard the door, her eyes tired in a way that did not come from lack of sleep alone. "You were with Howard," she said quietly. I nodded and hung my coat on the back of the chair, feeling the damp chill leave my shoulders. "We need to talk," I said. She did not move away when I joined her at the table. I opened the folder, set the laptop between us, and started from the beginning. I told her about the forged signature and the date that did not match my presence. I told her about the voice clip from the bank, about how it sounded like me without feeling like me. I told her about the recordings, about the strange cleanliness in the call latency that Howard had noticed, about the older file where Samuel Drake's voice appeared beside Grant's. Her face tightened slowly as I spoke. She listened without interrupting, at first her fingers pressing the side of the mug so hard I worried it might crack. When I mentioned the CEO, her eyes widened, then narrowed as if trying to make sense of a shape she could not see clearly. "Dad," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "Are you sure you are remembering things right?" The words landed with more weight than the volume carried. I blinked once, feeling the air in the room shift. She seemed to realize what she had said, but she did not take it back. She set the mug down, the ceramic making a small sound on the table. "I mean," she said, searching for softer phrasing, "it has been a lot. With Mom, with the shop, with everything. People forget things." I felt something in my chest go very still. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet certainty that a line had shifted between us and could not be moved back with a single apology. "You think I forgot where I was the day your son was born?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She looked down. Her fingers traced the ring on her hand. "Grant has been helping us," she said almost too gently. "After Mom died, when you were selling the store, things were tight. There were months when I did not know how I would pay Henry's tuition. Grant stepped in. He paid what we could not. He never made a big deal of it." She lifted her eyes to mine. "He was there when you were not." She added the words, slipping out before she could filter them. They hung in the air between us, heavier than anything else we had said. I watched the regret appear on her face, but it was too late to call them back. I looked past her at the spot on the wall where Laura once pinned up Henry's drawings, at the empty hook where her favorite apron used to hang. "I was selling the store for you," I said quietly, "for this family." "I know," Claire said, voice breaking a little. "I just mean in the day-to-day he was around." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "There is something I need to show you," she said. She opened an email and turned the screen toward me. The message came from an address that meant nothing to me. It used formal language, cold and clean. It spoke of observed cognitive decline, of concerns about my ability to manage finances, of a recommendation that my accounts be monitored or transferred. Attached at the bottom was a scanned document that looked like a medical note, complete with a logo and a signature that hinted at authority. I felt my throat tighten as I read. "And you believed this?" I asked, still looking at the screen. She swallowed. "I did not want to," she said. "But then you would forget little things. Call Henry the wrong grade. Misplace your keys." I told myself it was normal. Then this came. It made me wonder if there was more going on. She took the phone back and stared at the message herself, as if seeing it for the first time. "Howard thinks it is fake," I said. "Fabricated. Meant to plant doubt." Her shoulders dropped slightly. "Of course he does," she said, though there was less conviction in her tone now. "He is your friend." "Howard is many things," I answered. "He does not bend facts for anyone." She did not respond. The space between us felt crowded with things we had not said over the years. My absence when I buried myself in the business. her choosing silence when money got tight. Both of us making small decisions that now sat under the harsh light of what other people had done. I told her about what Howard found, how documents from Laura's charity work stored in the company's shared archives contained her clean signature samples. How those files could have given anyone with access exactly what they needed to fashion my signature without ever putting a pen in my hand. "Laura," she said softly, almost to herself. I nodded. She was careful with everything Claire went on. Files, receipts, permission slips, if someone used something of hers. She trailed off. The thought did not need finishing. It was enough to feel the echo of it. The clock over the stove ticked louder in the lull that followed. The kitchen seemed smaller, as if the walls had moved in a few inches while we talked. I could see the battle going on in her eyes, the tug of loyalty in two directions. A father who raised her and a man who stepped in when she felt alone. The past weighed against the present, memory weighed against fear. "I am not losing my mind," I said quietly. My eyes still on the table. I forget small things. I know that. But not days like the day Henry was born. Not my own signature. Not my own voice. Claire pressed her palms against her thighs. "I do not want to doubt you," she said. "I hate that any part of me does." "That is what they counted on," I answered. Doubt, not proof. We sat there while the light from the window shifted from gray to the first thin strokes of evening. She stood up first, walked to the sink and rinsed her cup, though it was already clean. Little movements to fill the silence. "I have to pick up Henry," she said eventually. I nodded. She put on her coat without meeting my eyes. At the door, she paused. For a moment I thought she might turn back, might say something to pull us closer again. Instead, she said only 3 words. "We will talk." Then the door closed behind her with a soft click. The house absorbed the new silence like a sponge. I walked back to Laura's office, passing the family pictures in the hallway. In one, Laura held Claire as a toddler. In another, she stood with Henry in her arms, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame. I touched the edge of one frame with my fingertips, feeling the cool glip. In the office, the air was still. I sat in the chair again and stared at the open laptop. I did not turn on any recordings. I did not open any files. I simply sat listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of a car passing outside. 2 fears settled in with the fading light. The first was losing my daughter's trust, a thread so central to my life that the idea of it fraying felt worse than losing any sum of money. The second was the fear that she might be right, that I was missing pieces of myself without knowing where they had gone. The house felt different that night, not just empty but divided. Laura's absence had left one kind of quiet. Claire's distance added another. It was as if 2 separate silences had taken up residence under the same roof. I rested my hands flat on the desk, watching how steady they stayed, and listened as the refrigerator cycled off, leaving the room in a deeper hush. The heater clicked off and the silence deepened, settling around me like a second skin. I sat there in the dim light of Laura's office, my hands resting on the desk, steady but heavy. The house felt divided, its quiet thicker than the hour before, and for a long moment I let it press against me. Then the phone on the table lit up. A single message from Howard. 1 line. The SEC had issued its summons. They wanted Grant to appear. They wanted me there too. Morning broke through the blinds in faint stripes. I dressed slowly, the fabric of my shirt stiff where it had dried overnight on the rack. I drove toward Columbus as the sun pushed its way over the horizon, the road ahead glowing a pale gold. By the time I reached the federal building, the day had sharpened into something colder, something that felt built of metal and glass and judgments. Inside, the air was dry and cool. The hallways carried the steady hum of footsteps, voices softened to murmurs, the subtle echo of government floors. Howard waited near a row of chairs, a stack of documents under his arm, his expression composed. He gave me a small nod. No words, none needed. We were called into a conference room where microphones sat in neat rows, the table long and polished. The windows offered a view of the city spread under a winter sky. A pair of SEC agents sat across from us. Their posture was exact, their faces practiced in neutrality. These were people who had seen every shape of deception and no longer reacted to any of it. Grant entered a few minutes later. For the first time since I had known him, he looked smaller. His shoulders hunched slightly. His eyes moved without settling. The confidence he once carried like a pressed suit was gone, replaced by a quiet sweat at his hairline. He avoided my gaze until the door closed behind him. The session began without ceremony. One of the agents tapped a file, signaling the technician at the corner of the room. The speakers clicked softly and recording 148 filled the space, Grant's voice at first slow and cautious, then Samuel's smooth and controlled. The coded phrases unfolded like a script written for people who understood what words could hide. Reclassify tolerance. Optimize buckets. Move high net worth clients quietly. The agents did not flinch. One of them made a brief note. The other leaned back, eyes narrowing a fraction. They had heard this kind of language before. They knew its smell. Howard leaned toward me slightly. They are understanding every nuance, he murmured. Grant shifted in his seat. His fingers twisted the edge of a tissue. When the recording ended, the room felt heavier. The first agent asked questions. Precise ones. Dates, names, account movement, internal directives. Grant answered slowly, his voice betraying the tremor he tried to swallow. He kept glancing at the binder in front of him, but it did not anchor him. At one point, the second agent adjusted her glasses and asked him to clarify the identity of Ethan Marston. The name landed in the room like a dropped coin. Grant opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He cleared his throat. The tissue tore a little between his fingers. He said he would answer in a separate deposition. He said it quietly, but the meaning filled the room. He was not going down alone. When the session ended, none of us moved right away. The agents gathered the documents calmly. Grant stood slowly, one hand braced on the table as if to steady himself. I watched him for a moment, the way he lingered, the faint tremor in his jaw. Then he left without looking at me. Howard and I stepped outside into a wind that cut clean through the layers of our coats. The sky had dimmed into late afternoon, the city carrying an edge of impatience. Howard put a hand on my shoulder. "This is unraveling," he said quietly. "Faster than they hoped it would." I nodded, but the cold made it hard to feel anything beyond the sting of air against my skin. That evening I sat in my truck outside the diner Laura used to love. The neon sign flickered, casting soft red light across the gravel. I had not eaten since morning, but hunger felt separate from me, like something happening in another body. Grant had asked to meet. I almost said no. Something made me come anyway. Inside, the lights were warm. The smell of coffee and fried batter hung in the air. I slid into a booth near the window. A waitress refilled the sugar jar at the table beside me, glancing over with a polite smile before moving on. Grant walked in a minute later. He looked like a man who had not slept, his shoulders drawn upward, his coat hanging loose. When he sat across from me, he lowered his eyes before lifting them again, as if gathering the strength to meet mine. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. I waited. He took a breath, hands clasped together on the table. "Ethan Marston was not a client," he said, his voice barely carried. "It was a synthetic account, a shell created to funnel money into an off-book line. It needed the appearance of legitimacy. They used fragments of your identity, just enough to make the account pass internal checks. The neon light pulsed against the window. His words settled between us with a clarity that felt almost physical. He swallowed hard. Samuel controlled it, he said. All of it. The transfers, the internal clearance, the cover language. He rubbed a hand over his face, the motion slow, exhausted. I never meant harm, he said. I swear it. I was cornered. Samuel had leverage over me. Something from years ago. A domestic matter. He knew how to bury me. How to bury my family if I pushed back. His voice thickened. I had two choices, cooperate or lose everything. Fear. Real human fear. It was there in every part of him. I did not excuse him, but I understood it more than I wanted to admit. The waitress brought us water without interrupting. Grant waited until she left. His hands were trembling now, not from cold, but from something deeper. There is something you should know, he said, his eyes lowering again. Something about Laura. My breath caught just enough to feel it. Years ago, she came to me about setting up a scholarship fund for Henry, he said. She did not tell you. She wanted it to be a surprise, a legacy, something that would carry her forward if anything ever happened. He paused, then forced himself to continue. She trusted me, completely, and they used that trust years later to build the profile they needed, to make your identity fit the patterns their system required. Every sound in the diner faded, forks, dishes, the low hum of conversation. It all dissolved into a thin ringing behind my ears. Grant looked at me, waiting for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe punishment, maybe nothing at all. For a moment I saw Laura in the booth with us. Laughing, her hand on the side of her mug, her faith in people was her greatest strength and the reason she believed in a man who would later help strip her family bare. I slid my hand across the table, not toward him, but toward the glass of water. The condensation cooled my fingers. I lifted it, took a slow drink, and set it back down. Grant looked away, then straightened his coat as if preparing to step into a colder wind than the one outside. I should go, he said. He stood. His reflection wavered faintly in the diner window, smaller than the man I once knew. I watched him walk out, the bell above the door giving one soot ring. Outside, dusk had settled fully across the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed. A gust of air brushed against the windows, stirring the snow in small circles along the ground. I stayed there a while, hands resting on the table, listening to the hum of the diner settle back into its rhythm, feeling the weight of everything that had cracked open in the space of one quiet evening. The cold followed me out of the diner and stayed with me through the drive home, a thin presence in the cab of the truck that refused to lift. By morning, it had settled into something quieter, a steadiness beneath my ribs as I dressed for court. The sky was washed pale, almost colorless, the kind of light that made the world feel honest, whether you wanted honesty or not. I drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, the courthouse rising ahead like a stone reminder that some truths required a room full of strangers to be spoken aloud. Inside, the marble floors carried the sound of every footstep. People moved with a kind of purposeful quiet. Howard waited near the courtroom door, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression firm but not cold. He handed me a brief nod. I returned it, grateful for the steadiness he carried. The courtroom was brighter than I expected. Tall windows let in a flat winter light that touched the wooden benches and the polished tables at the front. I took my seat beside Howard, the judge's bench, rising above us in quiet authority. Samuel was already there at the defense table. He sat straight, his shoulders square, but his jaw was set too tightly. When our eyes met for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression, a faint tightening near his throat, almost like a swallow he could not quite control. It was one of the first cracks I had seen in the mask he wore. Grant entered a few minutes later. His steps were slow, hesitant. He kept his head slightly lowered as if he wished to make himself smaller to leave less of a mark on the room. Melanie sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The room settled again when she gave the signal. The case began with the steady rhythm of procedure. Names, dates, exhibits. Howard walked the jury through the documents with calm precision. He placed the forged signatures beside the original samples from Laura's charity files. The curves matched too perfectly to be coincidence. The light from the windows reflected off the plastic sleeves, making the ink glimmer faintly. The jury leaned in. Then came Ethan Marston, a synthetic identity, a shell account, a ghost built from fragments of my life. Howard presented the record trail with the same care a doctor might use when tracing the spread of an illness. There was no drama in his voice. It did not need any. The facts did the work. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and walked toward the witness stand. My legs felt heavier with each step, but steady. The bailiff held the Bible out. I placed my hand on it and took the oath. For a moment, the courtroom blurred not from fear, but from the weight of what the next minutes meant. This was not about the money. This was about Laura, about clearing the shadow that someone had tried to cast over her memory. Howard's questions were simple at first. He asked who Laura had been. I told him. I spoke of her kindness, her stubborn strength, her belief in people even when they had not earned it. I saw Claire shift slightly in the gallery, her head bowing at the memory. It was a small movement, but it reached me more than anything else in that room. Howard moved forward gently, step by step. The day Henry was born, the hospital in Dayton, the hours spent holding my daughter's hand as she brought her own child into the world. I felt the jury listening not to sentiment but to certainty. Some truths do not fade, they stay sharp no matter how many years have passed. Then the defense rose. Samuel's attorney adjusted his jacket slowly before stepping forward. His voice carried an even calm. "You have said you sometimes forget things." He began, keeping his tone polite. "You lose your keys, you repeat questions. Would you say your memory is as reliable as it once was?" I held his gaze. "My memory for small things is not what it used to be," I said. "My memory for the day my grandson was born is exact." He pressed further, bringing up the anonymous email. The suggestion of cognitive decline, a fabricated medical note meant to seed doubt. "Is it possible you misremembered authorizations?" he asked. "Possible you approved something without noticing?" Behind him, Samuel watched me unblinking. A muscle jumped once in his jaw. "No," I answered. "It is not possible." He paused, perhaps searching for a seam. There was none. He stepped back. After I left the stand, I passed Samuel at a short distance. For a brief second, our eyes met again. He held his expression steady, but his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, his fingers curling once around the edge of his legal pad. His face did not speak, but the body sometimes betrays what words will not. Howard called Melanie next. She walked slowly, the strain of the moment pressing into the way she held her shoulders. When she took the oath, her voice trembled softly. She spoke of confidential agreements Samuel pressured her to sign. Meetings behind closed doors, warnings that left her sleepless for nights. He said it was about loyalty, she told the jury, but loyalty should not feel like fear. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Grant. He lowered his gaze. The room grew still when she finished, not out of drama, but out of recognition. White-collar crime does not steal from numbers on a screen. It steals from marriages, from sleep, from dignity. The closing arguments followed. Howard spoke with a calm, unshaken tone. He traced the path of deceit from the charity files to the forged signatures, from the promises in Grant's voice to the silent directives in Samuel's. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture widely. He simply laid the truth in front of the jury and stepped back. The jury left to deliberate. The courtroom exhaled. Minutes stretched. Someone dropped a pen 2 rows back. A whisper passed near the door. A brief shadow from a cloud shifted the light through the windows. I stared at the grain of the wooden bench in front of me, letting the details keep me anchored. When the jury returned, the room pulled tight around them. The foreman rose. The judge asked the question. The answers came with the quiet force of finality: libel, fraud, securities violations, restitution owed. Then Grant, guilty but recommended for leniency based on cooperation. A small sound escaped Melanie, half sob and half relief. Grant's shoulders sagged as if someone had cut invisible strings holding him upright. His chin lowered to his chest. That was the moment his mask finally broke. My own relief came differently, not in triumph, not in victory. Rather like the long, slow release of a held breath that had lasted months. My hands relaxed around the edge of the bench. The weight remained, but it shifted. It became something I could set down, even if only partly. I followed Howard toward the doors. When we stepped outside, the cool air touched my face like a clean cleave. The street noises felt distant. Traffic. A bus brake hissing. The faint echo of someone calling out across the plaza. Then I saw Claire. She stood a few steps down, her coat pulled close. Her hair lifted slightly by the wind. Her eyes found mine and held there. Not wide with shock. Not cold with distance. Just open, soft, unsure but reaching. The verdict had not fixed everything, but it had lifted the fog between us. She took one small step toward me. I stopped at the top of the steps, letting the moment settle, the gray light folding around us. The quiet stretching just long enough to feel like something new might rise from it. I met Claire halfway down the courthouse steps and felt the weight around us shift, not gone but lighter in a way that let both of us breathe again. The sky carried a pale softness that afternoon. A thin winter light settling over the city, as if even the day understood something had ended, and something else was waiting for its turn. Claire's hand rested on my arm, only for a moment yet. In that moment, I felt the distance between us release its grip. The weeks that followed moved with a slow steadiness. Some mornings I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling beside me, watching the full lift from the fields behind the house. The quiet no longer pressed in. It simply existed. Claire visited more often, sometimes bringing Henry, sometimes arriving alone, with the look of someone who had learned a hard truth and was still learning how to live with it. She carried herself with a gentler caution, as if she feared one careless sentence might reopen old wounds. One gray afternoon, she stood at the doorway holding a small USB drive between her fingers. She said Melanie wanted me to have it. Her voice soft and low, the kind of voice a daughter uses when she is trying not to ask forgiveness outright. She set the drive on the table with a careful touch, then stepped back as if the weight of it did not belong to her. I waited until she left before plugging it into the laptop in the den. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a muted light that pressed against the walls in soft colors. A folder appeared on the screen, plain and unadorned. Inside were internal emails, fragments of risk memos, and an audio file long enough to feel deliberate. When I clicked it, Samuel's voice filled the room, stripped of all the polish he wore in public. He sounded amused, careless, speaking about clients like me with an easy contempt. "Old men are easy marks," he said, laughing lightly as if the words were nothing more than a simple truth. I sat there long after the recording ended, The stillness in the room grew thick, settling over the desk and the bookshelves and the picture of Laura resting near the lamp. I waited for anger to rise, but it never came. Instead, there was a quiet recognition, something deeper than rage, the understanding that the truth had never needed volume. It only needed to be seen. Claire came by again that evening. She lingered near the kitchen counter, her eyes searching mine with the kind of worry that comes from love and guilt interwoven. She said she had doubted me because she was afraid of losing me, afraid of seeing signs she wasn't ready to face. I stepped closer and rested my hand on her shoulder. I told her the hardest part of growing older was not losing money or time, but losing the sense that your voice still mattered in the lives of the people you love. She let out a quiet breath, then moved into my arms with the ease of someone rediscovering a home they thought they had lost. When the settlement funds arrived, the numbers were neat and cold, the kind of precision that did not belong to the messy reality that came before them. I drove across town to a small community foundation office, the kind with framed photos of local families on the walls and a receptionist who greeted me with a warmth that felt almost familiar. There, with steady handwriting, I created the Laura and Henry Scholarship Fund. Laura had once mentioned the idea in a half-whisper on a quiet evening, unsure if it was fair to ask. Turning her unfinished thought into something real felt like touching her hand across time. A few days later, I drove to the federal prison where Grant was serving his sentence. The sky was a dull winter blue as I walked across the parking lot, the cold settling deep in my jacket. Inside, the visiting room hummed with fluorescent lights. Grant entered without the confident posture he used to carry. He looked worn but clearer. He sat across from me, his hands resting flat on the table. He said he never meant for any of it to become what it did. His voice trembled in places where pride had once lived. He spoke of Samuel's threats, the pressure, the fear that had followed him like a shadow. He said he was grateful I told the truth, even when it meant he had to face his part in everything. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I told him I hoped he would find a way to rebuild whatever pieces of himself were still whole. His eyes lowered for a moment, and in that silence I saw something familiar. A reflection of the man I could have become if fear had ever taken hold of me in the same way. Driving home, the road curved through open fields washed in the last light of day. The horizon held a glow of soft amber, the kind of light Laura used to love. I rolled the window down and let the cold air move through the truck, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. My grip on the wheel loosened as miles slipped by quietly beneath the tires. When I reached the house, the porch lights flickered to life with their usual hum. I stepped inside, then stopped near the doorway, feeling the stillness settle around me in a way that felt earned rather than given. A framed photograph of Laura rested on the hallway table, her smile set, her eyes bright with the kind of hope she always carried. I lifted the frame gently and held it for a quiet moment. I whispered a thank you. Barely a breath, not meant for the house or the air or the empty rooms, but meant for her wherever she might be. A thank you for the strength she left behind, for the belief she carried in me, even when I did not carry it in myself. Later, I sat on the porch in the chair she used to favor. The sky had darkened into a quiet blue and a thin wind brushed across the yard, bending the grass in small waves. A distant train sounded beyond the fields, its low horn drifting through the night like a reminder that life keeps moving whether we chase it or not. I leaned back, breathing steadily, letting the cool air settle into my bones. The porch light glowed above me, warm and steady, casting a soft circle over the boards at my feet. I watched it for a long time, feeling something open inside me. Something small and unhurried, like the first calm after a long storm. The wind shifted once more, carrying with it the faintest hint of pine and cold earth. and I let the night fold around me with a quiet I no longer feared.